Hello and welcome. In this video, I wanted to do something a little bit different because we're going to have a big points change and potentially rules change coming up within the following week. So looking at an army list may not be the best idea, considering that army list, for whatever faction I look at, will probably be obsolete within a week's time or so. So instead, I decided I wanted to do a little bit of a fun video where I take a look at something different, and in this situation I wanted to see if I had to fix the Adeptus Mechanicus codex, how would I do it? And the idea behind this exercise isn't to necessarily change everything and rewrite the codex as a whole, but rather to take what already exists and change it in a few ways to make it more interesting and a little bit better so that it's more functional on the tabletop. On top of that, I want to take into account some of the rumored changes that we know are going to be happening within the new chapter approved. In either case, if you have some ideas of your own, or you disagree with anything I said or want to add to it, do let me know in the comments down below, as it's always good to have a discussion on such topics. I'll be going down the codex section by section and looking at the different things that I would change, so if I don't mention something, it probably doesn't need any kind of change. With that being said, let's begin with our first section. The first section in the codex which features rules is the Forge World section. For the most part, I think the Forge Worlds are decently okay, though there are a few tweaks that I would do to the various Forge Worlds. To begin with, the biggest change I would make is removing the Solar Flare from the Lucius Forge World and making it a generic relic. I think the Solar Flare is very powerful and good, though I do think the issue is that it kind of pushes you into the Lucius Forge World if you want to utilize something like the Castle and Robots because their mobility issues really depend on that relic. And on top of that, I think Lucius already is a very powerful Forge World, so really taking that away from them isn't going to change how viable they are, though it would give them something fun in place of it and something thematic with the Solar Flare name, such as something that nerfs the enemy's hit or wound roll for a single turn, or something of that nature where it allows them to be a little more resilient, carrying on with the theme with their Forge World dogma, as well as their warlord trait. In any case, I do think there's a lot of things you can give them, though really the point is that I would like to see the Solar Flare be a generic relic as opposed to one specifically for Lucius. The other Forge World I would change is the Agrippina Forge World. The Agrippina Forge World is actually pretty solid, though the one thing I would change is I'd reduce the stratagem known as Indentured Machines, which gives +1 to Cataphrons toughness to cost 0 command points, that way encouraging you to take it and take Cataphrons when playing the Agrippina Forge World. The main reason for this is that within the new chapter approved that's coming out soon, the command point cost of stratagems like this becomes incredibly hampering, especially when you have so many different options that you already want from warlord traits and relics that are becoming incredibly prohibitive due to the command point changes. More so, I don't really understand why this one costs so many command points, considering you'll generally be restricted to 1 to 2 uses of the stratagem anyway, due to the limitations placed on it within the game rules. As such, for going into Agrippina, it would be fine giving 2 units of Cataphrons, +1 toughness, and then just encouraging you to mix them into a more mixed list. All in all, I think that would be a good change, and it would probably make Agrippina a much bigger contender for a Forge World that you would see within different tournament games. And there's another Forge World that I think probably needs some major changes, which is the Graia Forge World. This Forge World was already kind of a fringe one, as all the different abilities it has are very niche abilities, and sometimes they're very good, and other times they pretty much don't do anything. As such, I think this Forge World needs some kind of a change to make it more viable. As we saw in the past, that it was usually included as a small inclusion within a bigger army list to gain access to some of the psychic denial abilities that it brings to the table. As such, the thing I would change is looking at the relic. The relic is actually very bad as it only extends the range of different auras and abilities that the bearer uses. This is reminiscent, I think, of the old 8th edition Mars warlord trait, I believe, known as Static Psalm Code, and while that saw a little bit of play, it definitely wasn't something you particularly preferred on your different units. As such, I think the best way to fix Graia is not to change the Forge World altogether, but just change the relic to do what it does currently, and then add on top of that if you have an HQ choice with this relic equipped and that HQ choice is within a patrol detachment, it could be taken alongside with a different Forge World as a sub-faction. This would make Graia a little bit of a unique Forge World, as it would be the only one you could take in a battle-forged army alongside another Forge World within the same list. Additionally, you could probably give it the ability to refund some of the command points for the patrol detachment, thus encouraging you to use this a little more. That way you can make Graia sort of a themed Forge World that is a specialist against Psychers and is brought in alongside other Forge Worlds to deal with some of those threats, considering, if I remember correctly, the lore behind Graia isn't that they actually have a Forge World, but rather it's a mass of different spaceships connected together in order to form a pseudo Forge World that they inhabit, and it can actually break apart and move as a bunch of individual spaceships to transport the entire Forge World to a new location. So it would stay within that context, and it would be similar to how something like the Drukhari can have 3 different patrol detachments with 3 different factions within their army list, and it would definitely give Graia some more functionality that it's currently lacking without completely changing how the Forge World functions. Outside of those 3 Forge Worlds, a few things that would change is the Ryza probably needs its stratagem reverted, because right now it's completely awful, and I don't understand why they made the changes that they did to it, because it just doesn't make any sense. The Metallica Forge World is perfectly fine on itself, though I do think it has certain issues with how the Adeptus Mechanicus functions, which is what's really keeping it from being a top tier Forge World. I don't think you really need to fix anything with Metallica itself. I think it's more stuff you would have to fix internally to Admech that Admech currently lacks within the different set of tools that it has available to them. And finally, the last Forge World I would address is a custom Forge World known as Data Horde. And the Data Horde Forge World has a very interesting secondary ability known as Omnitrack Impellers, and what I would change about this ability is that it currently gives 2 additional inches of movement to the Cataphron and Honor Dragoon Crawler units. And the only thing I would change about this is I would extend that movement bonus to the Castellan robots, as the biggest issue with the Castellan robots is that the Castellan robots do have a little bit of a mobility issue, and them having access to an additional 2 inches of movement, as well as the primary benefit of the 6+ Feel No Pain save that the Data Horde Forge World offers, would really make the Data Horde Forge World very interesting when coupled with the Castellan robots. With the Forge Worlds out of the way, we come to the section of the codex that covers the stratagems. I think the stratagems are pretty much fine in themselves, though I do think the Admech have so many different stratagems that allow them to spend command points pre-game to gain different relics and traits on their different units. That's something that really needs to change about how the command point cost is structured for those different stratagems, as going into the new chapter-approved changes with how command points are going to function, and the rumors are that you're only going to start with 6 command points and you're not going to get a free trait or relic. That's going to make the use of these different stratagems incredibly hampering for the Adeptus Mechanicus, and I think a major theme of the Adeptus Mechanicus is that they like having different gizmos on both traits and relics, considering how many different ones they have. As such, I think they should probably reduce the command point cost so that maybe you get a couple of these for free and it doesn't cost you as much investment to take some of these additional relics and traits on your different Skitarii units, for example. So that's something that they could look at and maybe give you some kind of command point reduction, or some way to buy some of these with army points instead of command points. That way you can actually kind of customize your list without completely nerfing how your army functions due to starting with 0 command points. And in most cases, the majority of Admech lists out there would actually be starting with negative command points under the rumored command point changes. This is definitely a very hard place for Admech to be, and it's going to hurt them significantly if no changes are made to how they purchase some of these additional relics and warlord traits. And while I'm here, I might as well cover the Holy Orders as well. The Holy Orders are pretty much fine as they are, though I would change one little thing, and that's reducing the points cost of the Artisan's Holy Order. The Artisan's Holy Order wasn't seeing a particularly large amount of play as it is, so I don't understand why they bumped its cost up so much in the last points change for the Adeptus Mechanicus, so it was always a bit of a baffling change, and I would like to see them reverted to its original cost so that it might see a little bit more play than it currently does. Moving on, we come to our traits, and I think the only warlord trait I would change is the Carthago Grammatist warlord trait. That currently only works with the Electro-Priest units. Really, the only change I would make to this is making it cost 0 command points so that you can take it for free on one of your character units and enable the ability to deep strike 1 unit of Electro-Priests for free. This would encourage more play of something like the Corpus Carry Electro-Priests, as they make a decent enough stand-in to potentially compete with something like the Sterilizers in some army lists. As it stands now, this is already a warlord trait that doesn't really see any play, and going into the new command point changes, it's definitely not going to see any play anytime soon. I would say also the Electro-Priests are a very fringe unit, so giving some more justification for using them within different games would definitely be a very nice change, and would really help them out as a unit, as all of a sudden if this was a free warlord trait that you could put on any character, all of a sudden taking 1 unit of Corpus Carry Electro-Priests wouldn't really cost you anything and would be a decent include within an army list to take out small chaff units that the enemy may have, and take objectives and perform actions. Though even then they would still be competing for an elite slot, and that might be a tough ask to make considering how good the Rust Stalkers and Infiltrators are. Looking at the Doctrinas and Canicals, I really wouldn't change much about them, as I think they're fine as they are, though having 2 different sets of them with one set of them having only 4 and another having 6, as well as having a benefit and a negative on the doctrinas, does get a little clunky and complicated at times, so maybe if they reduce the complexity in some way, though really that's more of a nitpick than anything else. With that being said, let's take a look at the different unit types within the Adeptus Mechanicus codex. Looking at the HQ choices, I think the majority of them are pretty good and have a home within the game. The one I would change the most is Belisarius Call, as currently he really kinda doesn't have a place within the Adeptus Mechanicus forces, and that's kind of sad considering he's a very beautiful model. Now what I would change about him is I would probably unlock his ability so that he can benefit Cataphron units, as right now there's really nothing that benefits Cataphron units, and that would give him a bit of a unique role while giving the Cataphrons some benefits that they don't really get anywhere else within an army list. I would also lower his points a bit if I'm going to keep him the same otherwise, as he's a bit too expensive where he currently is. Other than that, I think that's pretty much the only change I would make. The one thing I would really like to see in the future is some kind of melee focused HQ choice that's kind of a big brawler. I think the biggest error that the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex had is making a cover page with this very interesting sort of tech priest unit that has this giant exoskeleton body, and a lot of people assumed that they were going to be getting a big HQ choice that can go into combat and just fight away like many of the other codexes did in some of their characters. Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass, and they kind of squandered that opportunity, though this kind of brings me back to what I said about Metallica, in that Metallica's rules don't really play that well with how Adeptus Mechanicus works, because Metallica has all kinds of neat toys, though the problem is that Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't really have a dedicated melee build as an army, making it kind of hard to utilize some of their abilities to their full extent. Though if there was some kind of melee-focused HQ choice that was kind of a bigger character and functioned as sort of an Adeptus Mechanicus Demon Prince, it would be kind of cool to take something like Ash Runner on him, as all of a sudden that would give him a lot more mobility and a lot more ability to just kind of put out damage, as well as something like Metallic and Lung. And if that HQ choice wielded an omniscient axe, they could even benefit Mars by being taken there and being given something like the Red Axe. Additionally, make things like the Pater Cogtooth and the Anzion's pseudo-generator a lot more interesting for the Adeptus Mechanicus. And I know the Dominus is kind of supposed to fill this role, though the Dominus still isn't quite that kind of unit and is just a little bit too clunky for that kind of role. I would really like to see something like the cover art for the Adeptus Mechanicus become a real unit that can be taken as a melee-focused HQ choice and get into combat with an enemy and just punch away. As far as the troop choices in the Adeptus Mechanicus forces go, I think the troops are pretty much fine, with Cataphrons needing some benefit in terms of accuracy, as right now they don't really have any real options in terms of improving their accuracy when it comes to shooting, which does make them a very hard unit to use, as otherwise it would be very interesting. As I said, you could probably achieve this by making Call be able to benefit Cataphrons, or by allowing certain units to benefit them specifically in terms of their ballistic skill. Either that or give them some kind of stratagem so that it's a little bit easier to shoot with them, as right now it does kind of hurt, especially if your opponent has any kind of modifier to reduce their accuracy even more, making them have a very difficult time to hit any of your opponent's units. I also think one other cool thing that they could do is maybe give you some more options, like giving you the option to take a unit of 5 Skitarii, 4 of them being able to be armed with special weapons. I know that Games Workshop doesn't like giving you units that you can't build directly out of the box, but I think as a special unit option that's limited in size and functions as a very glass cannon unit, it could be really fun taking a unit of 4 arc rifles or transuranic arquebuses, as that'd be kind of fun and kind of unique, though it would be a rather big points investment into a unit that's very easy to wipe out. However, it would give you some dynamic gameplay with some of your units and some more choices with how you build your army, thus allowing you as a newer player to maybe build some of those special weapons, take that small squad of special weapons and increase the points of your army, and then as you kind of build out your army, you can spread them out through the larger size squads, and as such you gain more different ways of playing your army, and you accomplish it by not really changing anything except for how you can cluster some of your different models once you've built up a little bit of a collection. Coming to the lead choices for the Adeptus Mechanicus, the biggest thing that needs some kind of support is the Fulgurites. The Fulgurites used to be a pretty popular unit when they can get a 3+ invulnerable save by taking out a unit within combat, though now they don't really see any play and they have been completely overshadowed by the Ruststalkers. The Corpus Gary can also use some kind of benefit, though I think if you reduce the cost of the Carthago Grammatist Warlord trait to 0, it would definitely increase their playability enough to probably see some inclusion within different data lists. I also would like to see some kind of change to the Datasmith, as right now the Datasmith is still a very annoying tax for the Castle robots, and that's still a little bit of an annoying hindrance, though I think he's alright otherwise, and I don't think he's the worst unit in the codex anymore. In any case, the elites outside of that are perfectly fine, and I think something like the Rust Stalkers and Infiltrators are pretty much where you want the army to be in terms of power level. As such, I definitely think those are some good choices within the army as a whole, and I definitely think there's something that really prop up the army at this current time, though even then other armies have access to better options than some of those, but at the end of the day those are other armies. Now taking a look at the fast attack choices, for the most part the fast attack choices are fine where they are, maybe a few tweaks here and there to dial in the points so that some of them are a little bit easier to include and utilize within the different games. But as a whole, the Sterilizers are great, the Iron Striders are still fine, Sidonian Dragoons do see some fringe play, so they could probably use a little bit of a buff somewhere. And on the topic of Sidonian Dragoons, the Radium Giselle really needs something because right now it's completely unplayable, though I think there's probably some way that they can make it usable. However, it would probably need a major rework to make it more interesting, so I don't really want to get into that too much, though maybe something like giving it a bunch of extra shots and not really changing the points cost would be the easiest way of improving its playability. Though even then, because the Taser Lance Dragoon is playable, I do think the Dragoon at least has some playability. The only unit in the fast attack choice that really isn't playable are the Taraxi Skystalkers, and I really don't know how you fix them because what they do just isn't that good. I think that unit needs a complete rework because right now the Sterilizers crush it completely, and the fast attack choice is so crowded that there's really never any reason to have that kind of unit within your fast attack choice in comparison to something like the Infiltrators, which have a similar weapon profile, but bring so much more to the table in the elite slot. Moving along to the heavy support choice, the heavy support choice is a rather odd place for the Admech at the current time, and most of the heavy support choices kind of aren't really playable. The Castellans are probably the best heavy support option, and I do think they're pretty good where they are right now, though I do think they need to solve some of their mobility issues, as well as the Datasmith tax. I think the biggest thing is, if you do some of the other changes I mentioned here, you could pretty much make the Castellans good without really changing anything on their profile by giving yourself access to something like the Solar Flare in other Forge Worlds, or by giving them that additional movement from the Data Horde Forge World, and there are a couple other changes that I'll mention later when talking about other units that can make the Castellans better. Outside of that, I think they're fine, and I think they're in a pretty good place for the people who want to play them. The Disintegrator, on the other hand, well, the Scorpius Disintegrator used to be one of the better choices within the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex. However, the Belleros Energy Cannon got nerfed going into 9th edition, which was still fine because it was still something you could include for the line of sight mitigation, though with the points changes and the indirect fire nerfs within the last balance rule set, that definitely took the Belleros Energy Cannon out of the meta completely. And on top of that, the Ferromite Cannon was pretty much never really in the meta to begin with, so all of a sudden the Scorpius tank became almost unplayable, even though a lot of players had it within their army list prior to that point. I think the biggest change you could do at this point to the Scorpius tank is completely reduce the points cost to a pretty much absurd level, where it makes sense to bring the Scorpius tanks once again. Think about it this way, if you made the Scorpius tank something like 100 points with whichever armament it came with, all of a sudden it becomes interesting to bring the Ferromite as a variance to something like the Iron Striders, because in that situation, the Scorpius tank is a little more fragile, can be bracketed, and has a few other issues, but it does give you more shots as you have the missile launcher in addition to the Ferromite cannon, so you do have that trade-off as well as the Scorpius being in a much weaker unit type slot than the Iron Striders, making it a more interesting option in that sense if it has such a low points cost. That does make the army even more expensive to play, as it's much harder to fill out those points, but at least then you have some interesting plays with those Scorpius tanks if they're low enough in points that you might even include them despite how weak they become. And one other heavy support choice that would probably change is the Dune Crawler. The Dune Crawler is a pretty awesome model and a pretty awesome option as it is, however the problem is it's kind of hard to take in an army list as it kind of eats up too many slots and it's probably just a little bit on the weak side. So maybe cutting it 5 to 10 points and allowing you to take a unit size between 1 and 3 for the Dune Crawlers and the ability to split up like Armigers or Carnifexes can could be a good way to buff the Dune Crawler without changing it completely. That way you could take 2 units of Castellan robots and a unit of 3 Dune Crawlers and have a pretty solid army. That's kind of hard to deal with while not forcing you into having a million heavy support choices. Additionally, it would allow you to take up to 9 Dune Crawlers within a list, which could be pretty interesting as it would be about 1,000 points of stuff, but give you a total of 9 Dune Crawlers, which can actually put out quite a decent amount of firepower within large enough numbers. And then the Neutron Cannon becomes a little bit better as well, as all of a sudden you have a lot more shots within essentially 1 unit of your army, instead of having to bring 3 individual Dune Crawlers, eating up 3 heavy support choices, which can be very awkward within different lists. I do think if you made those changes to the heavy support slot, you definitely see a lot more of it being taken, a much more competitive unit type for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces, which is something you want to see, as the Adeptus Mechanicus feel like they should be a heavy support focused army. Though really the Adeptus Mechanicus are kind of a mid-range army, which is kind of strange. With all of those unit types being covered, the only thing really left are the transports and flyers. The transports are okay-ish for the Adeptus Mechanicus, though I do think the Dune Rider probably needs a bit of a points reduction, and the problem is the capacity size of the Dune Rider is probably a little too limited for the large Skitarii units you want to bring, not to mention that now you kind of need to start with units within the transport, making it even more complicated. I think if you did Skitarii units of special weapons, then it would kind of be a little more interesting and give the Dune Rider a little bit more life, though as it stands, the only way I think you really make the Dune Crawler more playable is by cutting its points and making it a cheap enough transport option that the Admech can bring along. But with that being said, I do think it's a unit that's fine in itself and can probably see play even as it is now, so maybe you tweak the points just a tiny bit and give it a little bit more ability to transport some of those units. As for the flyers, the Fusilier and the Stratoraptor are fine where they are. Maybe they're a little too expensive, but they're still seeing a decent amount of play and they're still doing enough work to kind of justify where they're at, especially considering how powerful flyers are within the game of 40k. The only flyer that really doesn't do anything is the Transvector, and the Transvector is one of those units that you can't easily fix because of how it functions, though I do think one thing you could change about it is maybe allowing it to carry Castellan robots and a Datasmith. That way you improve the mobility of the Castellan robots and you give the Transvector something unique that other transports can't do within the Adeptus Mechanicus forces. That way all of a sudden it becomes kind of an interesting choice that gives you something very unique. Think about it this way: if you ever played something like StarCraft, you'll probably remember in StarCraft 2 the ability to pick up one of the big Thor gunwalkers and just drop it on top of your enemy and then let it do its job. So if you gave the Transvector the ability to carry something like 3 robots and a Datasmith, it would definitely be a really fun inclusion within a lot of army lists that I think people would have a ton of fun with. In addition to that, if you think about it, you can already put a Dreadnought in something like a drop pod, so why couldn't you put a couple of Castellans into a helicopter and just drop them on top of your enemy so that they can do what they need to do? And that way you kind of benefit 2 different units, as well as make an unplayable unit a much more interesting one, and that's just kind of my idea for it, but I can understand maybe why they want to avoid that, as that could be a little too good as well, though I do think the points cost of the Transvector would probably limit it from being over the top, and you'll be giving up one of your precious flyer slots as well. So with that being said, I think that's kind of everything that needs to be changed within the Admech, though if I had to look at a few things that I would do that are miscellaneous, that'd be more of a bigger change than just kind of moving around some of the abilities and points costs. I would say the top 3 things that come to mind is including that melee HQ choice that's kind of a brawler within the Admech forces so that they have something that can go into melee and pick fights with enemy units, sort of like the character we see on the cover of the Adeptus Mechanicus codex. Then I would give them some kind of more psychic interaction, as having no real way of interacting with psychers does kind of limit what the army can do and does create situations where the army might not be very playable if psychic forces are very playable. I do think changing the Graia relic to allow a patrol detachment of Graia to accompany other Forge Worlds would definitely be a good start, though I do think giving them some ways of interacting with psychers, sort of like the Necrons do or the Sisters of Battle, also known as Adeptus Sororitas, do, by giving them abilities to deny psychic powers but not giving them any psychers of their own, would be an interesting way of handling things in that sense. Considering that Necrons have void prisons and Sisters of Battle just can naturally deny things using things like Sacred Rites and other abilities, I do think that's a good way of handling it so that they at least have some kind of countermeasures to psychers without having to be forced into one specific Forge World that's not particularly that amazing either. So maybe some kind of unit that has some kind of anti-psyker capabilities, maybe even giving something like the Datasmith some kind of void prism-like ability that allows him to attempt to deny psychic powers, though I do think that creates the problem that now he's doing a little too many different functions within a single army, and that makes him kind of feel a little schizophrenic in that sense. And finally, the third thing that would change that's kind of a miscellaneous thing is by changing how dependent the Adeptus Mechanicus are on spending command points before the game even begins. As we see, a lot of the Forge Worlds have a ton of different stratagems that require spending command points before the game even begins, such as the Lucius Teleportation stratagem, the Grippin and Cataphrone stratagem, and the Styges 8 stratagem that allows you to do some deployment shenanigans. And on top of that, some of their troop choices can take relics and warlord traits, which cost more and more command points, so it's very hard to kind of get everything you want within an army list as it is, and with command point changes, it's going to completely cripple how Admech play, as all of a sudden they can't really gain access to some of those critical warlord traits or relics that they used to make heavy use of previously. and maybe that's a change you do by making some of the stratagems free so that they can get some of those relics and traits for free, thus giving them some unique identity within the game, or by allowing you to purchase some of those by using army points instead of command points. That could also be an interesting way to go about things, as the ability to reduce command point costs using things like holy orders is nice and all, but it doesn't change the issue of spending command points before the game even begins. And that kind of wraps up the video and all the changes I would make. Did you agree with these changes, or do you have some changes that you would like to see? And did you like this kind of video? Because if you guys did, I can do additional videos like this on other factions, though it really depends if you guys enjoy this kind of content or if it's just kind of a waste of time. Anyways, as always, thank you for watching, and as always, I want to give a big shout out to my patrons. You guys are really awesome people and really do help support the channel. In addition to that, I would like to say, if you know anyone who may benefit from this content, please do share this video with them, as it not only helps the channel, but it also helps them out as well. And if you've enjoyed the content, do subscribe and like for future videos from this channel. Thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.